Title: Shadows over the Peninsula, a Korean War Epic. Prologue: The Divided Land, 1945, Korea. The Second World War had ended, but Korea remained divided. Lieutenant Park Jun-ho, a former resistance fighter, dreamed of a united Korea. In the north, Commander Kang Dae-hyun, a loyal soldier to the communist cause, prepared for what seemed inevitable: war. Chapter 1. The Spark of War, June 25, 1950, the invasion of South Korea. Before dawn, North Korean forces stormed across the 38th parallel, overwhelming South Korean defenses. Jun-ho, now a captain in the Republic of Korea Army, ROK, struggled to organize a desperate defense in Seoul. Meanwhile, Dae-hyun led his troops south, believing he was fighting for the liberation of Korea. Chapter 2. The Fall of Seoul, June-July 1950. The capital fell within days. Chaos ruled the streets as civilians fled and South Korean forces retreated. Jun-ho and his men barely escaped, regrouping at the Pusan perimeter, where the last stand for South Korea began. Chapter 3. The UN intervenes, August-September 1950. The Battle of Pusan perimeter. As North Korean troops closed in, General Douglas MacArthur led a desperate UN defense. Reinforcements from the US and Allied forces arrived, turning the tide. Jun-ho found himself working alongside American soldiers, forming unlikely friendships in the trenches. Chapter 4. The Incheon Landing, September 15, 1950. In a daring amphibious assault, UN forces landed at Incheon, cutting off North Korean supply lines. Jun-ho was among the first to storm the beaches, while Dae-hyun's forces, caught by surprise, faced a brutal counterattack. Seoul was recaptured, and the UN pushed northward. Chapter 5. The Chinese Intervention, November 1950. The frozen Chosin Reservoir. As UN troops neared the Yalu River, the Chinese entered the war. Dae-hyun, now fighting alongside Chinese forces, prepared a massive counteroffensive. Jun-ho and his unit were trapped in the brutal winter battle of Chosin Reservoir, facing overwhelming numbers. Chapter 6. The Retreat and Stalemate, 1951. The 38th parallel. UN forces were pushed back south. Seoul changed hands once more before the war settled into a bloody stalemate near the 38th parallel. Jun-ho and Dae-hyun, once countrymen, now saw each other as sworn enemies. Chapter 7. Espionage and Resistance, 1951 to 1952. Behind enemy lines, while battles raged on the front lines, espionage and resistance movements grew. Kim Min-ji, a fearless South Korean spy, infiltrated enemy lines, delivering critical intelligence. Meanwhile, Dae-hyun struggled with the reality of the war. Were they truly liberators, or had they become oppressors? Chapter 8. The Forgotten War's Cost, 1952 to 1953. The ceasefire negotiations. Both sides suffered heavy losses, and peace talks dragged on. Jun-ho lost comrades, questioning if unity was ever possible. Dae-hyun saw his men grow weary, realizing the dream of a united Korea had faded into a political struggle beyond his control. Chapter 9. The Armistice and Aftermath, July 27, 1953. The war ends, but the division remains. A ceasefire was signed, but the war never truly ended. Korea remained divided, families were torn apart, and veterans returned home to uncertain futures. Jun-ho, now a seasoned soldier, looked at the doomsday, knowing the fight for peace was far from over. Dae-hyun, disillusioned, wondered if his sacrifices had meant anything at all. Chapter 10. Aftermath and Reconstruction, 1954 to 1956. Rebuilding lives. South Korea struggled to rebuild, while North Korea solidified its control under Kim Il-sung. Jun-ho transitioned from soldier to strategist, helping his country regain stability. Dae-hyun, now a high-ranking officer, faced the harsh realities of the regime he fought for. Chapter 11. Cold War Shadows, 1960s. Political tensions. As the Cold War intensified, Korea remained at the center of global conflict. Espionage escalated, and both Jun-ho and Dae-hyun found themselves entangled in the silent battles fought beyond the battlefield. Chapter 12. The Next Generation, 1970s to 1980s. Legacies of War. The children of war veterans grew up in a divided Korea. Junho's son, an advocate for democracy, clashed with the military dictatorship in the south, while Daehyun's daughter became a devoted party member in the north. Would history repeat itself? Chapter 13, A Fateful Meeting, 1990s, a chance encounter. In a historic inter-Korean summit, former soldiers and war veterans met for reconciliation. Junho and Daehyun, now old men, faced each other after decades. The war was over, but its ghosts lingered. Chapter 14, The Forgotten War Remembered, 2000s, revisiting the past. As the world moved forward, Korea remained divided. Historians uncovered forgotten stories of heroism and tragedy, ensuring the Korean War was never truly forgotten. Epilogue. Shadows over the peninsula. Decades later, the legacy of war. Junho and Daehyun never met again, yet their fates remain tied to a divided Korea. The war was called the Forgotten War, but its wounds never healed. In the end, neither side won. Only history remained to tell their story. The war ended, but the scars remained. Would Korea ever reunite?